The wind on the barren moon howled across the endless plains. Yellow dust rolled like waves, covering the sharp rocks and deep cracks in the ground. The sky above was pale, with a faint sun that gave little warmth. In this empty place, far from any city or home, a small figure sat curled up near a jagged ridge. His name was Rin. He was young, only a child by the standards of his kind. His skin was a pale green, with small, rough patches that looked like they had been burned by the cold wind. His eyes were large and black, reflecting the strange light of the moon. His arms and legs were thin, and his clothes were nothing more than torn fabric tied with pieces of string. He had not eaten in many days. Rin's chest rose and fell slowly as he breathed the dry air. He was tired, but more than that, he was lonely. His people had left him here. They said he was cursed. They said the way his face looked would bring bad luck to the tribe. Rin did not understand. He had never hurt anyone. He had never done anything wrong. But still, one cold night, they had taken him out in a small hover cart and left him in the middle of the desert. They had given him no food and no water. They did not look back. He had cried at first, shouting for his mother and father, but no one came. He had walked for hours, hoping to find a camp or a passing traveler, but the desert stretched on forever. Now he sat by the ridge, too weak to move, his small body shaking. He could hear strange noises in the distance, like the call of desert beasts. They would not come near yet, but when night fell, they might follow his scent. The boy pressed his knees to his chest. He tried to remember warm fires, the sound of laughter, the taste of fresh fruit from the trees of his home world. The memories hurt, so he pushed them away. The sky was bright above him, but the wind felt colder with every hour. Far away, on the other side of the ridge, a sound began to grow. It was a low hum, deep and steady. Rin did not know what it was, but his ears twitched at the noise. It was different from the sound of the wind. It was more like a song of metal and power. Slowly, the hum became louder, and then the ground began to shake. A small rover rolled into sight, its wheels kicking up dust. It was painted white with a blue stripe across the side. Inside, sitting at the controls, was a tall figure wearing a heavy suit and helmet. The glass visor shone in the light, hiding the face of the stranger. Rin's heart pounded. He had never seen one of these creatures before, but he had heard stories from the elders. This was a human. The rover stopped a short distance away. The human climbed out, boots sinking into the dust. The figure moved slowly, scanning the ground. In one hand was a long scanning device that beeped softly. The human looked around, perhaps searching for minerals or other signs of life. Rin stayed, still hoping the stranger would not see him. He did not know if humans were kind or cruel. The human turned in his direction and froze. The scanning device gave a sharp tone. Then the human began to walk toward him. Rin's breathing quickened. His first thought was to run, but his legs would not obey. His second thought was to hide, but there was nowhere to go. All he could do was watch as the tall figure came closer. The human stopped a few steps away. A voice spoke from inside the helmet, deep and steady, though Rin could not understand the words. The human crouched down, resting one knee in the dust. Rin saw a gloved hand reach slowly into a small pack on the human's side. The hand came out holding a silver flask. The human unscrewed the cap and held the flask toward him. The smell of water hit Rin's nose, and his mouth felt dry as sand. But he hesitated. What if this was a trick? What if the water was poisoned? The human tilted the flask forward slightly, letting a few drops fall into the dust to show it was safe. Then the human pushed it gently toward him again. Rin reached out with shaking fingers. The flask felt cold in his hands. He lifted it to his lips and drank. The water was clean and sweet, unlike anything he had tasted in days. It filled his mouth, then his throat, bringing life back into his weak body. When he lowered the flask, he found the human watching him with eyes that seemed calm and steady. The human spoke again, slower this time, as if trying to be gentle. Rin still could not understand the words, but he felt the meaning in the tone. There was no anger in the voice. There was no threat. Only a strange, quiet kindness. For the first time since his people had left him, Rin felt a small spark of hope. The wind still blew cold across the desert, and the sky was still empty, but something inside him began to warm. He did not know why this human had stopped for him. He did not know why the human cared. But in that moment, sitting in the dust, with water on his lips, Rin thought that maybe he was not as alone as he had believed. The human's name was Miles. He was an explorer sent by the Earth Alliance to map the far reaches of this moon. His mission was to scan the land, collect samples, and mark any signs of unusual activity. He had been driving his rover for hours that day, following a long path of ridges and cliffs. His fuel readings were steady, and the weather was calm, which meant he could travel farther than usual. When he had first seen the small figure near the ridge, he had thought it was just a shadow, or perhaps a strange piece of rock. The scanner had shown an energy reading that matched a living being. That was when he decided to stop and investigate. Now, crouching in the dust and watching the boy drink from the flask, Miles felt certain that this child was no threat. He could see the hunger in the boy's eyes and the weakness in his body. Miles waited until Rin had finished drinking, then reached into his pack again. This time he pulled out a small, soft food bar. It was wrapped in clear film. Miles unwrapped it and broke it into smaller pieces, holding one out for the boy. Rin stared at the food, then at the human, unsure. Slowly, he took it and bit down. The taste was strange but good. He ate the rest quickly, as if afraid it might vanish. When Rin finished, Miles stood and looked around the empty desert. His helmet, visor scanned the area for movement. The readings showed no other life nearby, but he knew this moon could be dangerous. Harsh storms could arrive without warning, and there were reports of alien tribes who were not friendly toward outsiders. Miles pointed at the rover and then at Rin, making a gesture for him to follow. Rin looked at the strange machine with wide eyes. He had never seen such a vehicle before. It stood on 4 large wheels, each covered in thick dust. A thin antenna rose from the back, sending quiet signals into the air. The human climbed into the driver's seat, then turned and patted the seat beside him. Rin hesitated, but the memory of the cold wind behind them made his decision. He climbed in. The inside of the rover was warmer than outside. The walls were lined with metal panels and blinking lights. A faint hum came from the engine. Rin sat, close to the edge of the seat, holding onto the strap near the door. Miles pressed a few buttons, and the rover began to move forward, rolling smoothly over the uneven ground. As they traveled, Miles kept glancing at the boy. He spoke every now and then, using a slow and gentle tone. Rin could not understand the words, but he listened. It was the first voice he had heard since his people had left him. The sound felt strange but comforting. Miles noticed that the boy often looked over his shoulder as if afraid something might be following. His eyes scanned the horizon again. At first, there was nothing but dust and rock. Then, far in the distance, he spotted movement. A group of shapes was riding across the plain. They moved quickly, riding small hover beasts that skimmed just above the ground. The scanner marked them as life forms with high energy output. Miles zoomed in with the visor's lens and saw tall figures wearing bone armor. Their weapons glinted in the sunlight. He understood immediately. Whoever these riders were, they were following the same path they had taken. It was possible they were simply traveling, but the way they moved told him otherwise. They were hunting. Miles had no doubt that they were the people who had left this boy to die. And now, seeing him with a human, they might be angry. Miles pressed. The controls! and the rover picked up speed. The engine hummed louder, and the wheels kicked up a trail of dust. Rin gripped the strap tighter, his eyes wide. He turned to look out the rear window, where the riders were growing larger in the distance. Miles spoke to him again, pointing forward, trying to keep him calm. They had to reach safer ground. The land ahead began to change. The flat plains gave way to low hills and scattered rock pillars. Miles used the terrain to hide their path, weaving between stone walls and narrow gaps. The scanner beeped, warning of a storm front building far to the west. The wind was shifting. Miles knew they would need to find shelter soon. Rin watched the human work the controls, his movements quick and sure. Every time the rover bounced over a rough patch, Miles kept one hand steady near Rin's side to make sure he did not fall. This simple act of care made something stir inside the boy. No one had ever done that for him before. It was as if this stranger truly wanted him to be safe. The riders were still following, but the rocks were slowing them down. Miles took a sharp turn into a narrow valley, the walls rising high on both sides. The sound of the wind faded here, replaced by the echo of the rover's engine. Rin kept looking back, but for a short time, they were out of sight from their pursuers. Finally, Miles brought the rover to a stop in a shadowed area beneath an overhanging cliff. He powered down the engine so the sound would not carry. Then, he opened a small storage box beneath the seats and took out a blanket. He wrapped it around Rin's shoulders. The boy held it tightly, feeling warmth spread through him. They sat quietly for a few minutes. Miles checked his scanner again. The riders had slowed, but they were still somewhere behind them. The human's mind worked quickly. They could not stay here for long. He would need to plan a path that avoided open ground until they reached the human base. Rin sat beside him, sipping from the flask again. He still could not understand the human's words, but he felt safer now than he had since the night he was left behind. Somewhere deep in his heart, he began to hope that maybe this strange being could protect him from whatever dangers lay ahead. Miles looked at the boy and gave a small nod. It was a silent promise. Whatever happened next, he would not leave him alone. The shadow under the cliff gave them a short rest, but Miles knew it would not last. The riders behind them were not going to give up. The scanner showed their signals still moving in the same direction. They were spreading out, trying to surround the area. That meant they were skilled hunters. Rin sat wrapped in the blanket, his small hands gripping it tightly. His body was still weak, but the water and food had given him a little more strength. He watched the human carefully. Miles moved with a steady calmness, checking the rover, scanning the horizon, and making sure the path ahead was clear. Every action was deliberate, as if he had done this kind of work many times before. The boy wanted to say something. He wanted to ask why the human was helping him, but his language was not the same. When he tried to speak, Miles only tilted his head and smiled faintly, not understanding. Still, the boy felt something in that smile. It was not pity. It was not fear. It was the kind of look that told him he mattered. Miles crouched beside the boy and pointed toward the horizon where the human base was located. He tapped his chest and then pointed at Rin, as if to say they would go together. Rin's eyes followed the direction of the pointing finger, though all he could see was a pale sky and jagged land. He gave a small nod. With that silent agreement, Miles started the rover again. The engine hummed to life, and they rolled out from under the cliff. He took a winding route between the rocks, keeping their speed steady but not too fast. He knew that if they moved too quickly over rough ground, the rover's suspension could break. It was better to be clever than reckless. For a while, the path was quiet. The walls of the narrow canyon shielded them from the view of the riders. Miles kept one eye on the scanner, the other on the road ahead. Rin stayed close to the side of the seat, his eyes darting between the rocks. Every sound made him tense. the crunch of gravel under the wheels, the low hiss of wind passing through cracks in the cliffs, even the soft beeps from the rover's dashboard. They passed a section where the canyon opened into a wider basin. Here, Miles slowed down. He could see faint tracks in the dust, the kind left by hover beasts. They were fresh. He knew the riders were close. He also knew that if they crossed this open space without a plan, they could be spotted immediately. Miles stopped the rover near a cluster of boulders. He turned to Rin and gestured for him to stay quiet. Then he stepped out and climbed onto one of the rocks, pulling a small binocular device from his belt. From this higher position, he scanned the basin. At first, the view was empty. Then he saw them. 3 riders moving slowly along the edge of the basin, their hover beasts gliding above the dust. They were scanning the ground, searching for signs. Their armor caught the sunlight, and the weapons strapped to their backs gleamed. They looked dangerous, their movements sharp and practiced. Miles lowered the binoculars and took a breath. He returned to the rover, keeping his voice low. He pointed at a narrow slope to the far left side of the basin. It was steeper than the main path, but hidden from view. Rin followed his gesture and understood that they would try to use it to slip past the riders. The rover moved again, rolling toward the slope. The ground was uneven, with loose stones that rattled under the wheels. Miles kept the engine at low power to avoid making too much noise. The climb was slow, but the slope curved behind a wall of rock, shielding them from the riders' sight. Just as they neared the top, the scanner gave a sharp warning tone. Miles glanced at the display and saw that another group of riders was approaching from the opposite side. They had guessed his route. He pressed the controls harder and the rover climbed faster. Dust rose around them as the wheels struggled against the incline. Rin gripped the edge of the seat, his heart racing. He turned and saw the riders in the distance. They were closing in, their hover beasts moving in swift leaps. The sound of their engines echoed across the rocks. Miles reached the top of the slope and turned sharply into a narrow pass. The walls here were so close that the rover barely fit through. The tires scraped against stone in some places, but the tight space gave them an advantage. The riders could not follow at full speed. The pass led them to another valley, this one filled with tall rock spires. Shadows stretched across the ground, breaking the view into patches of light and dark. Miles guided the rover in a zigzag path, weaving between the spires so no clear trail was left behind. After several minutes of careful driving, the warning tone from the scanner grew softer. The signals of the riders were still present but farther away now. Miles slowed the rover and stopped in the shadow of a tall spire. He turned off the engine, letting the silence settle over them. Rin sat breathing hard, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Miles reached into his pack again and pulled out another food bar, breaking it in half and handing one piece to the boy. Rin took it without hesitation this time. As he ate, he kept glancing at the human, still amazed that someone would risk so much for him. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of dried dust and stone. Miles checked the position of the sun. They would need to keep moving soon if they wanted to reach the base before nightfall. He knew the cold after sunset would be dangerous for Rin, whose small body could not hold warmth well in this harsh climate. Before starting the rover again, Miles spoke softly, even though he knew Rin did not understand the words. He told him they were going to make it. He told him no one would hurt him while he was here. The tone of his voice carried the promise more clearly than the words themselves. Rin looked at him and gave the smallest of nods. It was not just agreement, it was trust. Miles started the rover and drove on, deeper into the twisting valleys. He kept the scanner running and his eyes sharp. Somewhere behind them, the riders were still searching. But for now, they had slipped away, and that meant they still had a chance. The valleys seemed endless. Every turn revealed more walls of rock and narrow paths, but Miles knew that sooner or later they would need to cross open ground again. The human base was still many kilometers away, and they could not stay hidden forever. The scanner beeped every few minutes, reminding him that the riders were still there. They had not given up. Their signals shifted, closing in from different sides. It was like watching hunters circle their prey. Rin sat beside him, silent, but his eyes were sharp. He could feel the danger in the air. His people had moved like this when they hunted. They would spread out, trap the target, and then close the gap until there was no escape. The boy's small hands clenched around the blanket as if holding it could make him safe. Miles kept his speed steady. He knew the rover could handle rough terrain, but if the engine overheated, they would be stranded. His eyes scanned the sky as well. Dark clouds were gathering to the west. A storm was building. If it reached them, visibility would drop, and communication with the base could be lost. The path ahead began to rise. At the top of the ridge, they would see far into the distance, but they would also be easy to spot. Miles guided the rover up carefully. The wheels gripped the rock, pulling them higher until they reached the crest. From the top, the view was wide and open. Miles saw a flat plain stretching toward the horizon. In the far distance, barely visible in the pale light, was the faint outline of the human base's outer towers. It was still far, but seeing it gave him a burst of determination. Then his visor's lens caught movement. On the far edge of the plain, 3 riders appeared. Their hover beasts glided low over the ground, dust trailing behind them. Miles turned the rover sharply, scanning the other side of the ridge. 2 more riders emerged from a canyon, their armor dark against the pale stone. They were coming fast. Rin's eyes widened. He grabbed the side rail of the seat as the rover began to move. Miles pushed the engine harder. The hum grew louder, and the vehicle bounced over the uneven ground. The riders noticed the movement immediately. They spread out, 2 cutting across, the plane to intercept, while the others pushed forward from behind. Their hover beasts were faster than the rover on open ground, but Miles had one advantage. The land was filled with sharp dips and broken patches that the beasts could not cross at full speed. He guided the rover toward a low stretch of land, where broken slabs of stone lay scattered. The vehicle jolted and swayed, but it kept moving. The riders had to slow down to avoid crashing into the rocks, giving Miles a small lead. The wind picked up, carrying the first signs of the storm. A thin wall of dust began to rise in the west. Miles glanced at it and then back at the riders. The storm could work in their favor if it reached them soon. It would blind the pursuers and hide their trail, but it could also make it harder to navigate. One of the riders behind them raised a weapon. A sharp flash lit the air, and a small blast struck the ground near the rover, throwing up dust and pebbles. Rin flinched, ducking low in his seat. Miles swerved the rover, making the next shot miss. The chase became a pattern. The rover weaving through the terrain, the riders closing in whenever the ground flattened, the human forcing them back with quick turns into more difficult paths. Rin could feel every bump, every sharp movement. But he also felt that the human was not panicking. Miles was focused, his hands steady on the controls. They reached another ridge, steeper than the last. The engine strained as they climbed. Just as they reached the top, Miles spotted a narrow split in the land ahead. It was a canyon, its entrance hidden by fallen stone. It looked just wide enough for the rover to fit through. Miles aimed for it, turning sharply at the last moment. The rover slid between the stone walls, tires scraping against the edges. The sound of the hover beasts grew faint as the canyon walls rose around them. For a brief moment, they were hidden again. Inside, the canyon twisted sharply, blocking any straight path. The walls were jagged, and small rock fragments fell with every vibration of the engine. Miles slowed slightly, knowing the wrong turn here could trap them. Rin kept looking back, but for now, there was no sign of the riders. Then the scanner gave a sudden warning tone. Miles glanced at it and saw that some of the riders had split up and were circling around. They were trying to block the other end of the canyon. He pressed the engine harder. The rover shot forward, bouncing over dips. and ridges. The sound of the storm grew louder behind them, the wind whistling through the cracks in the canyon walls. Dust swirled in the air, stinging their faces even through the helmet's shield and the blanket. They reached a sharp turn, and Miles caught sight of movement ahead. Two riders were blocking the canyon exit, their hover beasts standing firm. Behind them, the open land stretched toward the human base, but they were in the way. Miles brought the rover to a sudden stop. Rin stared at the figures, his heart pounding. He had seen this before in the hunts. This was the part where the prey was trapped. The riders shouted in their language, voices echoing through the canyon. They pointed at Rin, then at Miles, making it clear they wanted the boy. Their weapons were ready. Miles did not move. He stepped out of the rover slowly, placing himself between Rin and the riders. The storm wind roared above, scattering dust through the narrow gap. The riders waited, perhaps thinking the human would surrender the boy to avoid a fight, but Miles' stance told a different story. His feet were planted firmly, his shoulders squared, and his hand rested near the tool belt at his side. His visor reflected the pale light hiding his eyes, but his voice carried through the helmet, calm, steady, and unwilling to give in. Rin watched from inside the rover. Something inside him shifted. For the first time in his life, someone was standing between him and danger, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The wind howled, the storm drawing closer, and the space between the human and the riders felt heavy with the choice about to be made. The storm was almost upon them. The sky above the canyon darkened, and the wind sent streams of dust twisting in the air. Small stones rolled down from the canyon walls, bouncing and clattering against the ground. Miles stood between Rin and the two riders blocking the exit. He could hear the distant hum of the other riders behind them, still making their way through the winding paths. The two in front shifted on their hover beasts, their armor rattling with each movement. One pointed at Rin again, shouting in a sharp, hard voice. The meaning was clear. They wanted the boy. Miles did not move. He raised his hand slowly, palm out, as if telling them to stop. The riders hesitated but kept their weapons ready. Miles' eyes scanned the canyon walls. The rock above the riders was jagged, with large slabs that looked loose. The wind from the approaching storm shook them slightly. He had an idea, but it would require timing and precision. He stepped backward toward the rover, moving slowly so the riders would not react too quickly. As he reached the driver's seat, he pressed a hidden switch near the steering controls. A small compartment under the dashboard opened, revealing a compact mining tool, a device meant for cutting through stone. The riders shouted again, their voices growing louder as they began to advance. Miles started the rover, the hum of the engine rising. The sound echoed through the canyon, masking the faint whine of the mining tool as he powered it on. Rin's eyes darted between Miles and the riders. He did not understand the full plan, but he could see that the human was preparing for something. He gripped the blanket tightly, his heart pounding. Miles revved the rover's engine, pretending as if he was about to make a desperate charge toward the riders. The two blocking the exit leaned forward on their beasts, ready to strike. Then, at the last moment, Miles turned the rover sharply toward the left canyon wall. The mining tool fired, sending a thin, bright beam into a weak point in the rock. The sound of cracking stone filled the air. A section of the wall above the riders shuddered, and before they could react, it gave way. Large slabs crashed down, slamming into the ground just ahead of the riders. Dust exploded into the air, and the hover beasts reared back, panicked. The path was not completely blocked, but the sudden rockfall forced the riders to pull back and regroup. Miles did not waste the chance. He turned the rover toward the partially open gap and drove forward at full speed. The tires skidded on loose stone, but the vehicle pushed through. One rider swung his weapon, but the blow hit the rover's side panel without stopping it. They burst out into the open plain beyond the canyon. The wind here was stronger, the dust storm now rolling across the land like a moving wall. Miles knew they had only minutes before visibility dropped to near zero. He aimed the rover toward the direction of the base and pressed the engine to its limit. Behind them, the shouts of the riders were lost in the howl of the storm. Rin turned to look through the rear window and saw only swirling clouds of dust. The canyon was already vanishing in the haze. The plane was rough, with dips and cracks hidden by the dust. Miles kept both hands tight on the controls, guiding the rover through each obstacle. His visor's display showed the base's signal, but the distance was still too great for comfort. The storm was moving faster than they were. The first wave of dust hit them, rattling the rover's frame. The sky turned an orange-gray, and the sunlight faded. Rin could barely see more than a few meters ahead. The world outside became a blur of moving grit. The sound was constant, a deep roar mixed with the hiss of sand against metal. Miles switched the rover's lights on, cutting through the dust just enough to see the ground in front of them. He knew the riders would have to slow down in this weather, but he also knew that if the storm grew too strong, they could lose their sense of direction and wander off course. Rin held on to the strap beside him, feeling every bump as the rover bounced across the rough plain. He looked at the human, seeing the focus in his movements. Even in the storm, Miles seemed steady, as if he had faced worse before. That gave the boy a strange kind of courage. They drove on for what felt like a long time. The dust outside grew thicker, and the rover's lights lit up only swirling clouds. Miles checked the navigation display. They were still on course, but the signal from the base was weakening in the interference. Then a faint noise broke through the roar of the storm. It was the low hum of engines, different from the rover's own sound. Miles knew what it meant. At least some of the riders were still following, their hover beasts able to move through the dust more easily than he had hoped. He tightened his grip on the controls. The chase was not over. The hum grew louder for a few moments, then faded again as the storm shifted. Miles used the chance to turn slightly, taking a less direct route toward the base to throw off their trackers. Rin glanced at him, not understanding why they were turning, but trusting that the human knew what he was doing. They passed over a shallow rise, and the storm briefly thinned, revealing a faint outline ahead, a tall marker pole with blinking lights. Miles recognized it as one of the guideposts placed by the Earth Alliance to mark safe paths. It meant they were getting closer to human territory, but it also meant the riders would know they were near the base. The hum of the hover beasts returned, closer this time. Miles kept the rover moving at full speed, weaving through small clusters of rocks. The wind tore at them and the dust stung, but the human did not slow. Through the haze, the outline of the base's outer towers began to appear. They were tall and solid, standing against the storm like silent guardians. Miles felt a surge of relief, but he did not let it show. They were still in danger until they were inside the walls. The sound of the riders grew louder one last time. Miles pushed the rover harder, the engine straining. Rin kept his eyes forward, watching the towers grow larger. Finally, the outer gates of the base came into view. Miles activated the rover's comm system, sending a short signal. A voice replied, through the static, confirming their approach. The heavy gates began to open, the lights above them cutting through the storm. Miles drove straight through the opening, and the gates closed behind them. The noise of the storm faded as they entered the sheltered space beyond. Rin let out a breath he had been holding, the tension leaving his small frame. The gates closed behind them with a heavy thud that echoed through the base. Inside, the air was warmer and cleaner. The strong lights showed a busy space filled with people in uniforms moving about. Machines hummed softly, and the sound of voices filled the corridors. For Rin, the noise was strange and a little frightening. He held tightly to the blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders, feeling small in this new world. Miles parked the rover beside a wide door marked with the Earth Alliance symbol. He switched off the engine and looked at Rin carefully. The boy's large black eyes were wide with uncertainty, but there was also a spark of hope shining in them. Miles pressed a button on his wrist communicator and spoke quietly. Soon, a woman appeared. She was tall and kind-faced, wearing a white coat. Her name was Dr. Lyra. She smiled gently at Rin and knelt down to his level. "Hello," she said softly, her voice calm and warm. "You are safe now." Rin did not understand the words, but her kind expression made him feel a little better. He took a small step forward, then stopped, unsure. Miles gave him a gentle nod, encouraging him to trust. Dr. Lyra motioned for Miles to follow her to a medical bay. The room was bright and clean, with soft beds and strange machines. Rin sat quietly on one of the beds as the doctor began to check him. She looked closely at his skin, his eyes, and his thin arms. She used small tools to scan his body and made notes on a screen. "You did well bringing him here," Dr. Lyra said to Miles. "He is weak and hungry, but he will recover." Miles smiled, feeling relief wash over him. "His people left him behind," he said quietly, "because they thought he was different." Dr. Lyra frowned. "That is cruel. Here, no one will judge him for how he looks." Outside the room, a group of soldiers and scientists gathered. They whispered among themselves as they saw Rin for the first time. Some stared with surprise. Others looked unsure. Rin could feel their eyes like heavy stones on his back. He shrank further into the blanket. Miles saw the boy's fear and stepped forward. "Rin is with me," he said firmly. "He is safe." One of the soldiers, a man named Joran, spoke up. "He is an alien. Are we sure he is not a threat?" Miles shook his head. "No. He is just a child. He needs help." Dr. Lyra added, "We will run tests to be sure, but from what I see, Rin is sick and scared, not dangerous." Slowly, Rin began to relax a little. The warmth of the room and the kindness of the people helped. A nurse brought him a bowl of soft food and some water. Rin ate carefully, tasting the new flavors. It was different from what he knew, but it was good. Days passed. Rin stayed in the medical bay. Miles visited every day, bringing small gifts. From the base, books with pictures, toys made from light, and clothes that fit him better than his torn rags. The boy learned to smile and even laugh sometimes. The humans at the base grew curious about Rin's story. Miles told them how Rin had been left alone in the desert, how the riders hunted him, and how the human had saved him. Many found it hard to believe that a whole tribe could abandon one of their own just because of his looks. One afternoon, Rin stood near a large window that looked out onto the base's gardens. The green plants and colorful flowers were new to him. He touched the leaves carefully, amazed by the softness. Miles stood beside him. "Your people were wrong to leave you," Miles said quietly. "You are not ugly or cursed. You are special." Rin looked up at the human and nodded. For the first time, he felt he belonged somewhere. The fear of being alone, forgotten, and unwanted began to fade. At night, Rin dreamed of a home where he was accepted, a place where people smiled when they saw him. He dreamed of friends who played with him and a family who loved him. Miles sat beside Rin's bed one evening. "You have a future here," he said softly. "Not because of who you are, but because you are you." Rin reached out and took Miles's hand. It was the first time he had done that. The human squeezed gently in return. In this new place, far from the cold desert, the little alien boy found warmth and hope. He was no longer alone. Days turned into weeks. Rin grew stronger. The food and care at the human base filled his small body with energy. His skin, once pale and rough, began to glow softly under the warm lights of the base. His eyes no longer showed fear, but curiosity and wonder. He learned to speak some human words, and Miles helped him practice. The people of the base started to see Rin not as a strange alien, but as a part of their family. Children came to visit him, curious about his large eyes and green skin. They wanted to play and learn about his world. Rin smiled more now, laughing when they showed him games and toys. One day, Miles took Rin to the base's training hall. It was a large room filled with machines and devices used to help soldiers and explorers prepare for missions. Rin was shy at first, but Miles encouraged him to try some of the equipment. The boy was surprised at how fast he learned. His small hands were quick and steady. The humans watched with admiration as Rin mastered the controls of a simple hoverboard, floating a few inches above the ground. He laughed as he zipped around faster than many others. Miles watched with pride. "You are strong," he told Rin. "Stronger than anyone expected." Rin's heart felt full. For so long, he had believed he was worthless because of how he looked. Now he knew he had a purpose. The humans had shown him that being different was not a weakness, it was a gift. The days grew brighter. The stormy skies of the desert became distant memories. Rin explored the base's gardens, watched the stars from observation decks, and listened to stories told by the elders of Earth. He learned about the many worlds humans had visited and the many friends they had made among the stars. One evening, Miles and Rin sat outside near a small fire pit. The stars shone brightly overhead. Rin looked up at the sky, feeling a deep connection to the vast universe. "Do you miss your home?" Miles asked gently. Rin nodded slowly. "Yes," he said in his soft voice. "But this is my home now." Miles smiled. "We will help you build a new family here. You are not alone." The boy looked at the human and then at the people around the base. They were kind and strong. They fought for justice and cared for others. Rin understood that humanity was different from his own people. Humans believed in hope and second chances. In the days that followed, Rin joined the young explorers in training missions. He learned how to use tools, how to communicate with others, and how to think quickly in danger. He found that his unique skills made him valuable. His sharp senses could detect dangers others missed. His small size allowed him to move where larger beings could not. The base commander, a tall woman named Commander Yara, came to speak with Miles one day. "Rin is a symbol," she said quietly. "A symbol of what humanity stands for. Compassion, strength, and acceptance." Miles nodded. "He is more than that. He is a reminder that no one should be left behind because of fear or hate." News of Rin's rescue spread beyond the base. Other colonies and ships sent messages of support. They wanted to meet the boy who had been saved from loneliness and danger. Rin became a symbol of hope for many. One bright morning, Rin stood before. A crowd gathered in the main square of the base. Children and adults, humans and aliens alike, watched as he spoke in simple words he had learned. "I was alone," Rin said, his voice steady. "I was left behind because I was different. But now, I am not alone. You are my family." The crowd cheered, and Rin smiled wider than ever before. He looked at Miles, who stood nearby, and gave a thankful nod. This was a new beginning, a future where kindness and courage changed the course of a life, where being different was celebrated, not feared. Rin's story was just one among many in the vast galaxy, but it was a story of humanity, of hope rising from the shadows, and of a little alien boy who found a home among the stars.